Our next poor devil finds himself on the edge. Actually, on the cutting edge of total terror. A steel blade, swaying, creeping, and coming down, swinging closer and closer in the Pit and the Pendulum.
Was I left to die of starvation in this underground world of darkness? Or what fate even more fearful was waiting for me? I had no doubt the result would be my death. The only thing I didn't know was how I would die and when. What made things worse was that I was condemned and thrown into this terrible place for crimes I did not commit. I was innocent of all charges. It was totally dark. I reached out and my hands felt a stone wall, very smooth, slimy, and cold. I followed it up, inching my way very carefully. I noticed that my normal clothes were gone, and I now wore a thick cloth robe.
He continued roaming about the dark dungeon, trying to figure out the size and shape, and perhaps, although unlikely, a way out. After a time, he fell to the ground from lack of food and rest. He then slept.
I awoke and found myself still trapped in this living nightmare. I stretched out my arm and discovered next to me a loaf of bread and a pitcher filled with water. I was too tired to think, but ate and drank. Shortly afterward, I started my tour around the prison cell again. I had walked some 10 or 12 steps very carefully when part of my robe got twisted on my legs. I stepped on it and fell hard on my face.
He came out of his daze after a moment and discovered something unusual. Although his body still rested on the hard, slimy dungeon floor, his head was touching nothing.
The terrible smell of the fungus and decay hit me hard. I felt around the floor and discovered I was at the edge of a round pit. Feeling around the stones just below the edge, I succeeded in breaking off a small piece and let it fall into the hollow space. For many seconds I listened as it fell and hit the sides of the deep hole. Finally there was a splash into water, then loud echoes. At the same time there came a sound of a quick opening and a fast closing of a door overhead, where a faint beam of light flashed suddenly through the dark, then quickly disappeared. I saw clearly the doom which had been made for me, and congratulated myself on how lucky I had been to escape the trap. One more step, had I not tripped on my robe, and I would have been dead. Shaking all over, I felt my way back to the wall, deciding to stay there to die rather than in the terrible pit. Fear kept me awake for many long hours, but finally I again slept. I woke up and found by my side, just like before, a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water. An incredible thirst overcame me, and I drank the entire pitcher in one gulp. The water must have been drugged because I immediately got drowsy. A deep sleep fell over me, a sleep more like death. How long it lasted, I don't know. But when I opened my eyes, there was more light in this horrible place, and I could now see the objects around me. I had been wrong in my guess of the size of the dungeon. Very wrong. I had been wrong also about the shape of the room. The general shape of the prison was square. What I had thought was stone seemed now to be iron or some other metal in huge plates.
Devices of torture were all about the room. Evil figures, statues of hideous ghouls, and skeletons were decorating the walls.
I now noticed the floor, too, which was stone. In the center was the round pit, the one I barely escaped from. All this I saw with great effort, for now I was on my back, laying on some frame made of wood. I was strongly tied to the plank by a long strap of cloth. It covered my whole body, holding me down, except for my head and enough of my left arm to reach a small amount of food left beside me in a dish. I saw, to my horror, that the pitcher of water had been removed. I say to my horror because I had a terrible thirst. This thirstiness seemed to be caused by the spiced meat left for me in the dish. Looking upward, I saw the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead and made totally of metal like the walls. In one of the high panels, a single figure got my entire attention. It was the painted image of a man holding a large pendulum, much like the ones used in antique clocks. While I stared directly upward at it, I thought I saw it move. In a moment afterward, I saw it was true. Its sweep was brief and, of course, slow. I watched the pendulum for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. I began to hear a slight noise. I looked to the floor and saw several enormous rats crawling around. They had come from the well, which was just to my right. Even then, while I looked, the hungry devils came up in troops, fast, smelling the scent of the meat. I squirmed and shouted at the ugly creatures. It took some time, but I managed to scare them away. It might have been half an hour, even an hour, before I again looked up. But what I then saw amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had gotten much bigger. It also was much faster. But what mainly disturbed me was the idea that it had gotten lower. I now saw with horror that the edge of the glittering steel pendulum was as sharp as a razor. It was connected to a heavy rod of brass, and the terrible tool hissed as it swung through the air. I now knew what horrifying torture and death I was going to suffer. I saw that the blade was made to cross the body at the heart. It would cut my robe. It would return and repeat its cuts again and again. Because it dropped so slowly, it would take many minutes for the pendulum to cut the robe. Down steadily, down it crept. I took a crazy pleasure trying to figure out its speed. To the right, to the left, far and wide, I laughed and howled with the thought. Down slowly, slowly down. It came within 3 inches of my chest. I fought hard to free my left arm. It was unbound only from the elbow to the hand. Had I been able to break the holes above the elbow, I would have grabbed and attempted to stop the pendulum. I might as well have tried to stop an avalanche. Down still, dropping still, swinging down. I gasped and struggled at each swipe. My eyes followed the blade's whirling ride, and then they would squeeze shut in fear of the downward swing. Oh, how unspeakable, how unspeakable. I saw that some 10 or 12 swings would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe. And with this thought, there suddenly came over me a strange feeling of peacefulness. For the first time during many hours or perhaps days, I went into deep thought. An idea came into my mind that the bandage or cloth which held me was the only restraint keeping me captive. The first stroke of the razor-like blade would cut through the cloth, and I would be freed. But how fearful in that case, the closeness of the steel. Any slight mistake on my part when I moved to escape would mean death.
He decided to make the final check and tilted his head up, to see the bandages which tied him down.
The cloth tied my body down in all directions except in the path of the destroying pendulum.
Just before losing all hope, another desperate thought came to mind.
For many hours next to where I lay, there had been hundreds of rats roaming around. They were wild, bold, hungry, their red eyes glaring at me as if they were waiting to devour me. They had eaten all the meat which was in the bowl nearby, but the juices of the red meat still remained.
He reached down for the bowl, rats biting at his hands, and came up with the meat juices upon his fingers.
I totally rubbed the cloth bandage which held me prisoner wherever I could reach it. Then, after raising my hand from the floor, I laid very still and motionless. At first, the starving animals were startled and terrified at the change, at the lack of movement. They waited for a moment. Seeing that I remained still as a statue and showed no signs of life, one or two of the boldest rats jumped on me and smelt the meat juices on the cloth. This seemed to be the signal for a general rush. They came in hundreds.
The rats swarmed all over his body, biting fingers, crawling over his mouth, and nibbling upon the meat-soaked bandages which held him prisoner.
In a few minutes, I felt that the struggle would be over. I was sure I felt the loosening of the bandages. I laid still as the rats continued chomping away at the cloth. I knew that many places must already be cut. I was close to being free. But, oh God, no! The pendulum had finally reached me and cut through the first layer of my robe.
The rats continued biting, and the man stayed still, sucking in his body as far down as possible. The blade continued its swing and cutting, now through the threads of his underclothing. Closer, closer, swing, rip, slash, edging ever so near to his skin.
I am near freedom. I feel the bandages getting looser. The pain from the rat bites is terrible, but I know it will mean my only chance to escape. I can now move more and more, almost free. The blade is getting closer. It's dropping closer, closer. I hear the hissing in my ears.